Hello, this is International Master and author John Watson. Welcome to Beyond the Opening. This is a show that explains positional ideas with a particular emphasis on pawn structures that recur throughout chess practice. This will be my 9th lecture on isolated pawns and their relatives, or their descendants as Nimzowitsch calls them. Okay, we've covered pure isolated pawns. That is an isolated pawn on an open file by itself, then isolated pawn couples, and then hanging pawns. Tonight we're going to talk about another structure that usually arises from isolated queen pawns. It's called the ram structure. We saw it last week in a game, and we saw a very good example way back when we looked at the Karpov-Ullman game in an early lecture. I think it was the second isolated pawns lecture. But there the discussion was about the isolated queen pawn itself and not the ram structure. I have a lot of examples of ram structures. It's an extremely important and frequently arising structure. So rather than talk about it in general, and also it's a really common way of treating the isolated queen pawn. So let's talk about it in terms of examples. So the first example is not a game, but a simple example of the ram structure, and just one aspect of it. Okay, so this is the symmetrical English. We're actually going to look at an opening for a change, but without really analyzing it. Okay, that's the symmetrical English. Okay, black, now it's slightly unsymmetrical. We'll see why that's important. Okay, black's trying to make it symmetrical again because he knows white's going to play d4 too. There we go, almost. And now black makes it symmetrical. But we're going to just look real quickly at what he might have done instead, just because it's sort of instructive, but really quickly. He could have gone there, which prevents the symmetry. But then white, for example, can go here and look at this. 1, 2, 3 pieces on that pawn. Black would defend somehow, maybe like that. White might attack these pawns and threaten to make that a real target. And in any case, I don't know what black would do. Black might play here, and white might play here. And you can see this pawn's getting in big trouble because white's about to take that. So that's an example of where even when the c pawn advances, this isolated pawn that's behind the other one, behind the d pawn, can get in trouble. So actually at this point it's not isolated, but if black takes that at some point it'll be isolated. Okay, and then let's go back and see something a little more relevant, which is that black could simply castle. But then we have white taking that, and probably the best way to do this is to win the isolated queen pawn this way. So basically what happens is that white simply wins that pawn. For example, the isolated queen pawn falling immediately. We haven't seen too many of those, but of course it happens. I put a few more moves in here just to examine what might actually happen. Just this move. Just protecting that. Bishop e3 follows with tempo. Okay, so now let's get back to what we really care about in this game, which is if black captures that pawn and white recaptures. Now there's the ram. One isolated pawn in front of the other. I think it's called that because rams are butting their heads together. I think it's in Hans Kamak's Pawn Power in Chess, but I don't seem to be able to find my old copy, so I can't verify that. In any case, so I think he made up the term. Never liked that book much anyway, so that's the basic. That's just the ram. We talked about it briefly before. It usually comes from positions that have isolated pawns, and then there's an exchange on d5. This is the only example, a regular isolated pawn on an open file, and then there's an exchange on d5. That'll be true of all our examples except this one. Very often in ram structures, the advantage is determined by who has the better minor piece. or minor pieces, and often. And here, the knights are the only different minor pieces, the way they're placed. But it's a huge difference because this knight blocks off the bishop. And more importantly, if you look at this knight's going to come here, attacking this pawn 3 times. Black's knight can't do that. And black's knight also can be exchanged off very easily, and therefore the defense of this pawn can be weakened. So we'll see that. Here's what happens. Okay, why is he doing that? He's doing that to stop bishop g5 and takes, followed by winning this pawn. And I'm going to show you that in a second. But we're going to continue first with just the simplest possible example. It's not even an example, it's just an opening. Okay, we're on this 3 times. Now the only thing is, if you take it immediately, then this bishop will be freed and black will be able to take your isolated pawn. So white simply protects that, and now he's threatening to take this isolated pawn, and there's really nothing to do about it, because after this move, probably the best shot, white can actually attack that for the 4th time as well as attacking the b pawn, and then he simply wins the isolated queen pawn. So that was really simple, maybe not brilliant moves, but it's just something to show. Now let's go back for a second to this position where he played h6. Now he could just castle here. It's a little more difficult, but the point is I just wanted to show you, there goes one of the defenders. Now this has to be protected, so he does. And then here there's no immediate win of the pawn. Even though there's a lot of tries, they don't work out that well. So maybe white just develops, and you'll see why he does that in a second. Black just develops. Now white puts that knight on the square we were talking about, where black can't put a knight here. So he's attacking that queen pawn a few times. Turns out black can play that move just because he's got counter pressure there. However, it doesn't really work out. This follows and this follows. Now we're threatening to win the queen. And if black plays here, we simply take it. We just want a piece because we take the queen next. Little trick. So black actually wouldn't take it in this position. Black would play back, which is still not completely easy because white can't defend this pawn easily. But he simply makes a move, and you'll see why that works. Because after he takes here, we have several ways to attack that knight. Well, one simple move here, I believe, yes, one simple move here would be this, winning a pawn, because if he takes, check, winning that, and if queen takes here, then just check first and then take back. So that's an example. I think there's a better move even with this move. And threatening this twice, threatening maybe knight e7 check. If the knight comes back, then it's lost in any case, because after takes, okay, there's temporary piece sacrifice, and the queen is attacked, but check, and you win the exchange. Plus the 7th rank, with all kinds of good ideas. Okay, so that's just a quick example of what might happen, and a simple example of the RAM structure and how the better placed knight there was the one that decided. And actually that was almost decided right away, the knight on e2 versus the knight on f6. You'll see that things aren't that simple, but let's go to another example. Okay, we've seen this kind of position before numerous times, but with a knight on f3 instead of e2. But the same thing, you've seen all this before. White played the battery, weakened to the king side. Black got his pieces out quickly, covers d5. And let's just see a few moves here. Let's just continue. Okay, now what's white doing here? Well, white's thinking about maybe making this move. It's a possibility, maybe in conjunction with that move. And black maybe panics a little early or becomes a little too worried about it. And he allows the ram, which happens this way. Takes back. There we go. So that's the ram structure. And let's just keep going for a second. White defends that pawn, covers some dark squares. Black wants to put the knight on a square like that, nice aggressive square. Okay, so now maybe stop here for a second. The ram structure is decided by better minor pieces. We talked about that. And in this case, that's a bad minor piece. A very, very typical one, by the way, because usually this pawn is the one holding up this pawn. And so usually it's this bishop that becomes bad when this ram structure is created. Now, if the bishop isn't there, by the way, and the ram structure is created, then usually it's just going to be an equal game. We're showing examples of where one side has an advantage. Okay, so this bishop is better than that bishop, and in fact this bishop's stopping the move bishop a6. That explains the last move to some extent. White also has ideas of knight b5 here, which would threaten the a pawn and maybe the d6 square. So black stops that. However, that makes the bishop even worse. And white starts attacking. There's no way to win that d pawn, but black is tied to the defense of that pawn, and the knight is far away from the king side too, so that's always a good sign. Okay, white just sort of wanders over, threatening f5. Now see, f5, f6 was a huge threat, or f5 and some other attacking idea. So black simply stops it. Unfortunately, that makes the bishop even a little worse, and of course exposes the king a little more. So let's just continue. White takes the file. White now has this idea about playing here and putting more pressure there, which if nothing else will tie black down. Taking the file. By the way, f5 also made that a more or less permanent outpost. Black has a permanent outpost too, but he can't get to it. And then, well, he takes over the outpost, doesn't he? And now what we see is that usually you need two advantages to win a ram position, sometimes even more, and we'll get to that. But now he has the file too. He really controls the e file. So he's got the better bishop and the e file. Let's just keep going here. More pressure here. Black finally just sort of gives up on that one. Now you can see that white's rook is much better than black's also. And there we go. That's an important thing. That black's tied down, but there's no way to win the d pawn. So usually when we get in this kind of position where one side's tied down, we've talked about this a lot, open a second front. And here's the second front on the king side. You'll see that a lot. If he had taken that pawn, then the queen gets active, covering that square. f5 is possible. So he tries to kind of hold on here. And now white makes a key move. He attacks this first, not so key maybe, and then plays that move. So what's that about? Well, it threatens checkmate, and the idea is that if black takes, we have this nice checkmate here. So black has to give up his queen, I guess. Okay, that can't be allowed, so instead black plays here. And so you've seen the point. Look at this good bishop versus this bad bishop. This all came from this structure, the outpost and the kingside attack now. And in fact, that's a mistake. Maybe I should, well, no, let's not stop here. It's sort of interesting. He had a win here, I should show that at least, which was like that. And that wins a second pawn and increases the attack. The seventh rank is coming, and the only option, well, I mean, if he takes it, the only problem with taking it is he's going to lose yet another piece. So 2 pieces down with check, so that's not going to work. Okay, but he doesn't do that. It makes his maybe only mistake of the game, probably maybe some time pressure. And black goes over, threatens the g-pawn. And now, really, white hasn't played this correctly. Black's going to get that pawn back, but that's okay. He still has the better bishop. And let's just see why better bishops win, even though it's not quite relevant to the ram structure. Okay, now black's tied to defending this. So he has to go somewhere. And the king gets centralized, and that's what really makes all the difference. Okay, now because the king's coming up and everything's going to kind of fall apart here, black starts moving his pawn, but then that's exposed. Black needs some counterplay before he just gets killed, but it's not like the pawn's going to queen. So here's how this goes. Now the rook can't move away because that's hanging. Can't move from the file, so it has to go backward or counterattack. In this case, he counterattacks white's rook, and this pawn is going to fall. But it's not just that the pawn falls, the king gets centralized, which is more important. And in fact, he simply takes the rooks off, and he's going to win this. If the pawn advances, it's with check, and he wins the h-pawn too. Doesn't resign quite yet, but it's certainly coming up soon. And now he steps back into the box so he can stop this pawn, and that means that his passed pawns will win. So let's What was the moral of that story? Well, the ram structure meant that this remaining bishop, was very bad, and white ended up getting a file and a second front. So he had a number of advantages that finally added up to a win. Okay, here we have a nice world championship game. A very famous game, actually. It was the game where Botvinnik invented, I think it was the first time he played this funny g4 move, attacking a bishop on f5. And to this day, it's a powerful tool. So let's just see what happens here. Okay, and black creates the ram structure. Now it's interesting because he could have avoided that by playing, for example, some move like this, which in fact happened, but of course that allows an isolated pawn. Went like this, and now he took that. And now he played this move to stop that d4. Remember, d4 is the big move in these positions because it activates all the pieces. This one attacks the bishop, covers some weak squares. The point is, this was Korchnoi versus Karpov, and Korchnoi won this game as white. So, very famous game, actually, very nice game. So, it wasn't, creating the ram was not completely illogical in view of what happened in that game. So, let's return. And there's the ram structure. So white is no longer attacking this isolated pawn in an open file, but instead he's gotten a structure that he likes. Why does he like it? Well, his bishop is better than this bishop, and he has more space. He has space on the king side. Now that's not a heck of a lot to go by, but it turns out this is just difficult for black to play. He has to sort of sit and wait while white continues to get more space and improve the position of his pieces. Right now the files are equal, but because you have more space, you have a tendency to win more squares on a file. Okay, threatens h7, knight comes back, stops knight e4, handy move. Now this structure, and we'll see this a few times, is a very nice ram structure, mainly because it does stop knight e4, usually because that's easily defensible. Doesn't always work, but tends to be a good position. Okay, white makes this bishop look a little better. It wasn't such a great bishop a second ago. Okay, and tries to take the file, and now that's a nice rook. He doesn't dominate the file. It's not an outpost because he can be theoretically kicked away, but it's attacking from the flank. It's attacking that pawn. So black now has to, at some point, black has to stop this from being attacked, followed by winning this pawn. And let's just see some moves here. This is interesting what happens soon here. Okay, he takes the file. He really has better control of any file than black does. And he takes that, and that's actually pretty nice. Transformation, that's the kind of thing that really works. Now he takes this way. And now still have the ram structure, and you'll see why this is good for white in a second. Well, actually, for one thing, we simplified, where a knight is better than a bishop, better than a bad bishop. If he had played here, he has, well, several problems, but one of the problems is this move. And then he gets pinned somewhere, maybe here, and loses that piece in a few moves. And if he doesn't take the pawn, there's all kinds of problems. For nothing else, the a pawn's hanging. So let's go back there for a second, see if we can make these pieces move backwards. There we go. So the other thing after taking would have been advancing that and just winning this pawn, and also that pawn would have been very strong for other reasons. So black takes with a rook. He doesn't want to, but he does. White simply defends that pawn for the moment. Now there's just some maneuvering going on, but there's some interesting maneuvering. There we go. Now he's thinking about putting it on that nice square. His knight is better than black's bishop. Black stops that. Knight comes back. Now the knight's threatening to go to this nice square. Black stops that, but now he has weaknesses. Both of those moves were weaknesses, and you'll see them coming in handy later. Okay, when you have more space and you have some other advantages, maybe some pressure on this d pawn and the better minor piece, then you often open a second front. And opening a second front means advancing this pawn, getting more space, and most importantly of all, he's thinking about making this move g5. And then black will either have to take or allow himself to be taken or play f5, and then that big square will fall for a knight, for a rook, for a queen, maybe even for a king in the endgame. So that's a long-term problem, and in fact that's what happens. And that's all because this weakness was created. Okay, still bad bishop, still good knight. There it is. That's the move. Now he's going to win e5. First he plays to attack that weak point there. That's important too. If it comes back thinking about e5. Now he takes. Okay. But the fact that that's a weak point on e6 is important. And here we have just pure position of knight versus bad bishop, which is not always a win, but in this case you have space also. You have a free path for the king. You have a nice rook that can go to e5. It's going to be enough to win. Petrosian definitely plays a good move there. He's trying to mix things up. Now white has c5, which is a nice square. The rest is pretty much technique. This is a huge positional advantage, and Botvinnik's technique is always worth looking at, so we'll zoom through this real quickly. Now, the interesting position here, because it looks like he can get rid of his bad bishop for the knight, but then of course the rook's going to just come over and win this, or the king's going to win this, and it's just a dominant position. He really can't afford to take that. Okay, the king keeps moving forward. There we go. Now he takes, but it just loses a pawn for now. And now it's a pass to d pawn. Turns out it's easy to stop the h pawn, as we'll see in a second. By playing f4, it stops this pawn. And now that d pawn's too strong. I don't know if he resigns or no. Actually, why should he? Might as well see what he can do here. Now he resigns. The d pawn's going to queen pretty easily. You can check that out, with specifics. You never know about these rook endings, but this particular one is winning pretty easily, and so Petrosian recognized that and resigned. Good game, interesting game. Now you've seen this position before many times, or well, not this exact position, but certainly the same idea. The knight's not in the same place, and in fact that's interesting because this is a little more sophisticated example, by the way, because the knight stops d5, which as we know is a huge move. So white plays his usual moves, puts everything in the center. Black plays his usual moves and really stops d5. White plays knight e5. We've seen that. White puts his rooks in the center. Black puts his rook on the c file. White defends his bishop. And that move, I think, is a pretty bad move. Maybe not too surprisingly. What he wants to do really is play b5, play knight c3, control all these light squares. We've seen how that can win for black, almost without white resisting sometimes. It's just extremely strong. The problem is, and it's easy to miss this, black should probably create the hanging pawns right away. That would be the way to do it. You can't get too ambitious with this a6 and b5 idea. Okay, attacking that indirectly. Not quite yet, but it's certainly going to be attacked. Maybe bishop d6. And now white can play bishop takes e6, and that's very complicated. But if you look at it for a while, it turns out to be about equal. Maybe even black has a tiny advantage at the end. So what white might try is attacking, defend this square, and move the rook over. We've seen that. But black is kind of ahead of the game and would play. What do you play here? Probably this move. There's a couple moves here. Maybe it's only equal, but he gets rid of some pieces. We've seen that that's a good idea. So this may even favor black. Just not enough force here for white to have a sort of checkmating attack, and the queen's away from the king's side. So in the game, by the way, this is an Ivan Sokolov game, and I'm getting 2 of these games of his from Winning Chess Middle Games, which is a really great book. I should say, very good book, especially though if you're a d-pawn player, because all the examples, I believe, except for maybe a Petrov's at one point, I have a Petrov's example actually, are from d-pawn, and just a few d-pawn openings, key d-pawn openings, Queen's Gambit, Nimzo Indian. Nevertheless, this is a great player who's written a great book. So you can benefit from it anyway, but just to warn you that it's a fairly limited set of openings to look at. Okay, so where are we here? He plays this a6 move, and it's very hard to see why this is a mistake, because that's a move that's very easy to miss. You just wonder, well, how can that be so good? And here's really the key. The key is that if he plays here, you get your ideal d5 move in. And it happens to be a position where this is just very good. Let me just show you a quick example. Takes, bishop takes is maybe, it doesn't really matter. Takes, takes, threatening, knight f, bishop f7 or something like that, takes, rook takes. And as so often with this d5 advance, everything's activated. Now black is well developed, but he's a little passive, and it's just one of those positions where things don't work, mainly because that natural move runs into that. I guess he could defend that way and lose the bishop. So that would be a win. And what else can he do here, basically? Well, he could try to play here, but that's right on the file. So we might get, not sure what we get here. What would be the best move here? Everybody look? Everybody see what they think? Well, how about that? Trapping the rook, continuing the pressure. That wouldn't be so bad, would it? I bet everybody saw that faster than I did. So, I guess there's this, but that's pinned, and you can just attack it several times. You don't even need to, but you could attack it a million times, but you're going to win that piece. So, what's left? The game. The game he had to take, because of this, he had to take with the bishop instead of the knight, because he couldn't allow d5. And that led to the ram structure. So here we've got the ram structure, and guess what? The same old bad bishop. Knights versus bishops here. The knights are going to be better than the bishops. One of them can be exchanged off, but they can't both be exchanged off. And there are disadvantages to exchanging it off also. So this position tends to favor white, and this is no exception. White attacks this pawn, and the problem is that if the pawn moves, then you get knight c5. So he finds a nice way of defending. This position is really awful. Look how bad this bishop is. It's even with tempo. Look how good this rook is, going this way but also going this way, and white can double, triple, whatever. So that's just disastrous. Luckily black has anticipated this. Now if white plays queen takes, he just loses a piece. If he plays knight takes, he's going to lose to rook b8. So at least he manages to get away without weakening the queen side too much. Got to get rid of that rook because there's three pieces on that. So that creates another weakness on e6. Just look how passive black is. White's just very active. Things are going well here. Okay. The other plan in positions like this is to kind of put the knight on this great square here if possible, but he doesn't need it as it turns out. He's threatening rook e7, and there's much to do about that. So let me just whip through the moves here and show you what happened after this. It's pretty clear white's got enough to win here. He's got the file and the good knight versus bad bishop. Let's just see this for a second. That's the other idea, rook d6. I should have mentioned that. Very good idea. See, because he can double on the 6th. An interesting idea. I love these exceptional ideas. Instead of doubling on the 7th, he doubles on the 6th. Kind of cute. Okay, nothing happening so far, but that double on the 6th plan will come in. Oh, I mentioned knight e2, f4. So there we go. That was the problem with f6. Of course, it was necessary, but doubling on 6th again. And doubling queens and rooks on the 6th. That's this pawn here. There's no good way to defend that. You can check that out in a second. Well, obviously there's not. Queen d8 that hangs this. So he can't defend f6, so he gets another pawn. And now you can see the king is falling apart. Check. He's already a pawn ahead. Threatens discovered check, and then just breaks through. Even without that move, it'd be an easy win. And now it's just a question of, did he calculate correctly? And it's Ivan Sokolov, he probably did. Okay, so that's the end of that game. Let's quick get to another one. Okay, I'm using the impressionistic technique here, which is where you go through examples pretty quickly, but I think that's very useful. Sometimes I've gone slower in this series, but I think it's nice to see a lot of games, a lot of positions, so you can see the similarities. You can always go back over and look at them more slowly, but oh, look at this, Caro-Kann. Isn't that nice? I mentioned originally how many isolated pawn positions there were. I didn't realize I showed the opening. We don't go over openings, right? Guess what? We've seen this one. Gee whiz, have we seen this one? Except b5 is not a particularly good move. Generally we castle here. b5 has problems. One is it uses a tempo, so the ram structure tends to be better when you have an extra tempo. The other is that square is weakened. If white had to retreat, that b5 would have been a good move. But often we play b5 when the knight's still on f6, so there's no bishop takes d5. So what's the advantage here? Good knight versus bad bishop. Now it's not that bad this time, but white also has lead in development. Simplified positions can be very good here. Oh, look at that move. Now that's important to see. We're kind of zooming through this because we're a little out of time, but very nice idea. So black has to kind of respond to that. That's going to be a huge knight there. And white's in no hurry to go there, but the threat is always there. What's that? The threat is always stronger than the execution. Okay, now the C file, unfortunately for black, is starting to be controlled. Remember, I was talking about having two advantages. Now we have maybe three. Good knight versus bad bishop, wonderful knight outpost, and pretty soon you'll see his file controls a little bit better. So these are just moves. Now that's a very good move, but for kind of tactical reasons. We're talking about a world champion here, about Vinix, so it's not surprising. He takes, let me see, the first tactical point is that if he captures here, these pieces are just a little loose, and so it's just an exchange to start with. So it's not as though anything bad has happened, and this knight is hanging, and it's almost trapped. If he goes here, he's got the problem that the rook is hanging, which means this, back rank mate, and or rook capture. It's cute, right? Sort of thing we'd miss in a game, right? And if he plays, well, what else does he have? This is not so easy. Oh, well, he can play bishop e6. That's right, because the knight is protected over here, but things are going wrong here. We're still threatening rook takes. We're still threatening queen d8 once the knight moves. And the knight has no really squares, does it? So that's really the end of that game. You can check that out. So in the game, he couldn't take that d pawn. He takes that, and he can't take it again because of that. Getting the pawn back, and of course there's the back rank mate theme. I won't go any further than that. The queen has to move, and white's pieces are just too active. And this stupid rook is just sort of sitting there. It's a problem now. It's a nice idea, but it just didn't work out. So back to the game real quickly so we can finish this up. Retreats. And white just managed to sort of reorganize his pieces. That's a nice move. He's going to use the C file. He's going to use that. There we go. So there's a pin. If you look at this, there was really nothing black could do. And if the knight takes, we have queen takes c8 check. So these may not be perfect moves, but so that's pretty much over. There's that rook again. And queen down here check is going to be a killer. So he resigns because the king moves, queen here, and there's some sort of checkmate. So thank you very much, everybody. This has been Beyond the Opening, and you get an idea of this RAM structure. RAM structure is decided often by who has the better minor piece. I should mention, by the way, that black also wins some games from the RAM structure. It just happens that all my examples are with white. There's reasons for that having to do with the various openings. You're more likely to get it as white, and there's reasons that when I did my database searches looking for good examples, I was looking from the white point of view for this structure. Most of the famous book examples are also as white, but just for the record, you'll get these. You can get these things as black too. You know, white has this. You have this isolated pawn, and you create a RAM structure, or vice versa. So again, thanks you very much. This is Beyond the Opening. We're going to continue with RAM structures next week because they're really good to look at.